The soft chime of the clock echoed in the quiet house, signaling 7 a.m., another day of solitude for Eleanor. She shuffled to the kitchen, her slippers skimming the tiled floor, and prepared her morning tea. The ritual was as predictable as the rising sun, each sip a placeholder for something unspoken, something missing. Her life had become a series of small, unremarkable routines since her children had moved out and her marriage had ended amicably years ago. Eleanor's world was calm, almost too calm. Her days were spent reading, tending to her modest garden, and making polite small talk with neighbors she barely knew. It wasn't that she was unhappy. She had long learned to embrace her independence, but loneliness lingered, an invisible guest at her table. That morning, her grocery list was more of a suggestion than a necessity. She grabbed her canvas tote and headed to the market, the air crisp and scented with early autumn leaves. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, her mind occupied with memories of her youth, days when trips to the store meant snacks for lunchboxes or dinner for a family of 4. It was in the produce section that she saw him. He was bending over a display of apples, his brow furrowed in concentration. He couldn't have been more than 30, mid-30s at most, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the muted hum of the store. Eleanor caught herself staring, surprised by the small flutter in her chest. "Do you know if these are any good?" he asked, holding up a Honeycrisp apple. His voice was warm, casual, and disarmingly friendly. "I think they're in season," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the unexpected spark she felt. He grinned, a boyish charm lighting up his face. "Seasonal expert, huh? I'll take your word for it." They exchanged a few more words, about apples, recipes, and how the store's layout seemed designed to confuse. His name was Ryan, and he was new in town, recently relocated for work. Eleanor shared a little about herself, careful to keep her words light, though she felt a strange ease in his presence. As they parted ways, Ryan waved cheerfully, clutching his bag of apples. Eleanor lingered a moment, her heart unusually light. It had been a long time since a chance meeting had left her smiling. The drive home felt different. The familiar streets looked brighter, the day warmer. Eleanor tried to dismiss the feeling, attributing it to the novelty of speaking to someone new. Yet deep down, she knew, Ryan had stirred something dormant within her. She didn't yet realize how much her life was about to change. Eleanor didn't expect to see Ryan again, yet she found herself back at the grocery store a few days later, wandering the aisles with a curious sense of hope. She shook her head at her own foolishness. What were the odds he'd be there again? And yet there he was, this time near the bakery section, examining a loaf of sourdough as if it held the secrets of the universe. Still on a culinary adventure, Eleanor teased, surprising herself with her own boldness. Ryan turned, his expression brightening. "Eleanor, the apple connoisseur. You were right, by the way, they were delicious." Their conversation picked up as if no time had passed. Ryan spoke about his work in graphic design, his love of hiking, and his struggles with learning to cook for himself. Eleanor found herself opening up more than she expected, sharing snippets of her own life, her love of literature, her grown children, and the peaceful solitude of her home. "I could use some cooking tips," Ryan admitted with a sheepish grin. "Or maybe just someone to stop me from burning water." Eleanor laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. "Cooking isn't so bad once you get the hang of it. Start small. Maybe something simpler than water." They walked together through the store, their conversation light but layered with unspoken warmth. Eleanor was acutely aware of the easy way Ryan made her laugh, the genuine interest he seemed to have in her words. It was a stark contrast to the polite but surface-level interactions she usually had. When they parted at the checkout line, Ryan waved again, this time with a promise. "Next time you have to share your go-to recipe." "Deal." Eleanor nodded, her cheeks warm. "Deal." In the days that followed, she found herself thinking of him more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his youthful charm or his easy smile. It was the way he made her feel seen, as though her words mattered in a way they hadn't in years. They crossed paths again and again. At the grocery store, at the small coffee shop nearby, and even at the local farmer's market. Each time, their conversations grew a little deeper. Ryan asked about her favorite books, and Eleanor found herself recommending the classics she'd once devoured in her 20s. One afternoon, over coffee, Ryan pulled out a notepad and scribbled something. "I'm making a list of all the things you've suggested. Books, recipes, hikes. I'm on a mission now. Eleanor smiled, touched by his earnestness. She hadn't felt this alive in years. Ryan's presence had become a bright thread weaving its way through the fabric of her quiet days, and she realized she didn't want it to stop. Still, she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than a simple friendship. After all, he was much younger, and surely he saw her as nothing more than a kind acquaintance. But as their connection deepened, Eleanor couldn't deny the stirrings in her heart, the beginnings of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long, long time. Eleanor stood in her kitchen one evening, absently stirring a pot of soup, when the memory of Ryan's laugh drifted into her mind. It wasn't just the sound, though it was warm and unguarded. It was the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way his whole face seemed to light up. She set the spoon down, gripping the counter for support. This wasn't just admiration or gratitude for the companionship he'd unknowingly offered her. No, this was something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her heart fluttered at the thought, and with it came a wave of panic. No, she murmured aloud, shaking her head. This wasn't possible. She was 54, a mother, and a woman whose life had long since settled into its quiet, predictable rhythm. He was what? 30, maybe 32? Young enough to have a world of options before him. Eleanor paced the length of her small kitchen, trying to reason with herself. It was just loneliness playing tricks on her mind. She told herself. Ryan had been kind, attentive even, but that didn't mean anything. He probably treated everyone this way. But as much as she tried to rationalize, her thoughts betrayed her. She remembered the way he'd leaned in to listen when she spoke, the way he'd remembered her favorite books and even texted her a photo of the apple pie he'd attempted to bake, all thanks to your advice, he'd written. And the way he looked at her. Eleanor froze mid-step. There was something in his eyes, wasn't there? A warmth, a focus, a way he seemed to notice her in a manner no one else had in years. Or was she imagining it? That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as her emotions twisted into a knot. Part of her felt exhilarated, as though she'd stumbled upon a secret garden she'd forgotten existed. But another part of her felt afraid. Afraid of being foolish, of misinterpreting his intentions, and of what others would think if they knew. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" she whispered to the dark room. The following morning, she avoided the places where she might run into Ryan, telling herself she needed space to think. She busied herself with chores, errands, and anything to occupy her mind. But even in the hum of the vacuum or the shuffle of papers on her desk, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. By the third day, Eleanor found herself lingering near the grocery store. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, unsure whether she hoped to see him or dreaded it. When she turned the corner into the produce section and saw him examining a bunch of bananas with a mock serious expression, her breath caught. "Bananas today?" she asked, her voice teasing but tinged with a nervous edge. Ryan looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Eleanor, you caught me in the act of overthinking fruit again." As they chatted, Eleanor felt the walls she'd tried to build around her heart begin to crumble. It wasn't just his words, or his laugh, or the easy way he shared pieces of his life with her. It was how he made her feel. Alive, seen, wanted. For the first time in decades, Eleanor felt the spark of something more than friendship. It was terrifying, thrilling, and utterly unexpected. Eleanor couldn't escape the tidal wave of emotions that followed her realization. Each time she thought of Ryan, her chest tightened with a mix of longing and dread. She spent hours trying to dissect her feelings, questioning whether they were real or a fleeting illusion born from her loneliness. At the heart of it all was fear, not just of rejection, though that loomed large, but of judgment. What would her daughters think if they found out? Her friends, who already teased her for being too set in her ways. And Ryan himself, did he even see her that way, or was she just a kind older woman he enjoyed chatting with? One afternoon, Eleanor sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching raindrops streak the glass. Her thoughts were a storm. She felt selfish for even entertaining the idea of being with him. He deserved someone younger, someone who could match his energy and share his future. Yet every time she tried to talk herself out of it, another memory would surface. The way he'd lingered during their last conversation at the store, his gaze steady and warm as though she were the only person in the world. The way he'd brushed a strand of hair from her face once, so casually yet intimately, as they laughed about her fumbling attempt to reach a high shelf. She touched her cheek now, where his fingers had grazed her skin that day, and a shiver ran through her. The internal battle was relentless. Her mind told her to retreat, to maintain the safe distance of friendship, but her heart rebelled. It had been so long since she felt this alive, this vulnerable, this desired. One evening, unable to contain the swirl of emotions, she called her closest friend, Marjorie. "I think I'm losing my mind," Eleanor blurted after the initial pleasantries. "What's happened?" Marjorie's voice was calm, curious. "There's this man I've been talking to," Eleanor began, hesitant. "He's younger. Much younger." "How much younger?" Eleanor winced. "Probably 20 years. A pause stretched between them. Then Marjorie said, "Well, is he kind to you?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice soft. "Does he make you happy?" "Yes." "Then why are you torturing yourself?" Marjorie's tone was matter-of-fact. "The world has enough rules, Eleanor. Love doesn't need to follow them too." Eleanor's throat tightened. "But people will talk. My daughters." "Your daughters want you to be happy, even if they don't realize it yet. And people will always talk, Eleanor. Let them. This is your life, not theirs." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her living room, Marjorie's words echoing in her mind. Was she brave enough to follow her heart, knowing the risks? By the time she climbed into bed that night, a decision had begun to take shape. She didn't know where her connection with Ryan might lead, but she knew one thing for certain. The fear of living a life untouched by love was greater than the fear of what others might think. Eleanor spent the next few days wrestling with her decision. Her heart felt lighter after her conversation with Marjorie, but the practicalities of her feelings remained daunting. She resolved to take a small step forward, something manageable but meaningful. She decided to invite Ryan over. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. It wasn't an extravagant gesture, just an invitation for tea, yet it felt monumental. What if he declined? What if he accepted, and the dynamic between them changed forever? She stood in the grocery store aisle a week later, clutching her basket with nervous fingers as she waited for him to arrive. She hadn't planned it this way, but her subconscious must have nudged her into his usual path. Sure enough, Ryan appeared, his easy smile lighting up his face. He wore a denim jacket today, slightly frayed at the edges, and carried a reusable shopping bag slung over one shoulder. "Eleanor," he greeted, his tone as warm as always. "How are you?" "I'm well, thank you," she replied, feeling her pulse quicken. "And you?" "Can't complain. Busy week, but it's good to see a friendly face." They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, chatting about mundane topics, whether new products in the store, a recipe he'd recently tried. The familiarity steadied her, and before she could second-guess herself, she took a breath and spoke. "Ryan, I was wondering, would you like to come over for tea sometime? I've got a new blend I think you'd enjoy, and well, it's been a while since I've had company." Her words hung in the air, and she braced herself for his response. For a split second, doubt clawed at her. What if he misinterpreted her intent? What if he thought it was strange? But Ryan's smile widened, and his eyes softened with something that looked almost like gratitude. "I'd love that," he said. "When works for you?" Relief and excitement coursed through her in equal measure. "How about this Saturday afternoon?" "Around 2. "Perfect," he said. "I'll bring some scones. I've been trying to perfect my recipe, but I'll warn you, they might still need some work." They laughed, and Eleanor felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift. When she returned home, she set about preparing for his visit. She dusted shelves, arranged flowers on the dining table, and spent an absurd amount of time debating which tea set to use. It felt silly. Fussiness had never been her style, but she couldn't help wanting everything to be just right. By the time Saturday arrived, Eleanor was nervous but determined. She told herself it was just tea, just a friendly gesture. But deep down, she knew it was more. This was her first step toward something she'd spent far too long denying herself. The possibility of joy, connection, and maybe even love. Eleanor opened the door at precisely 2:00, her heart fluttering in her chest. She had spent the last half hour making sure everything was perfect. Her favorite floral tea, the delicate china cups, the freshly baked scones that Ryan had promised to bring. Yet, despite her preparations, She couldn't escape the anxious thrill that seemed to pulse through her every time she glanced at the clock. Ryan stood at the threshold, holding a small basket with a cloth covering it, his smile as warm as ever. "Hope I didn't keep you waiting," he said, his voice light. "Not at all," Eleanor replied, her own smile forming effortlessly, though it felt like it took all her energy to stay calm. "Please come in." He stepped inside, his presence filling the room in a way that made it feel simultaneously cozy and electric. The scent of fresh scones mixed with the light floral notes of the tea, creating an atmosphere that felt both inviting and intimate. They sat at the table by the window, the afternoon sun casting soft, golden beams across the room. Their conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from Ryan's work to Eleanor's love of gardening. She marveled at how easy it was to talk to him, how little effort it took for the words to spill between them, like they had known each other far longer than they actually had. As they shared stories, their laughter seemed to fill the spaces between them, each chuckle a tiny thread weaving them closer together. Eleanor found herself savoring every moment. The way Ryan listened so attentively, his gaze steady and warm. The way he spoke, his voice filled with passion for the things that mattered to him. And then, there was the way he made her feel, young again, seen, valued. Somewhere between the second cup of tea and a quiet shared silence, Eleanor caught herself staring at him. Not as a friend, but as a woman seeing him in a new light. The connection between them, so natural and effortless until then, suddenly shifted. It wasn't just the easy familiarity anymore. There was something else in the air, something delicate but undeniable. She felt a pull toward him, a desire to close the small gap between them, to touch the warmth of his hand on the table, to feel his presence in a way that was different from the conversations they had shared. Ryan, ever perceptive, caught her gaze and held it for a beat longer than usual. His lips parted slightly, and for the briefest moment, Eleanor swore she saw a flicker of the same awareness in his eyes, something deeper, something more than the friendship they had built. She didn't dare to break the silence at first, afraid the moment would shatter if she spoke. But when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, as though he, too, had sensed the shift. "This has been really nice," he said, his voice almost reverent, the words carrying more weight than a simple compliment. "I've missed this, spending time with you." Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest, and she wasn't sure if it was the unexpected admission or the way his words felt like an invitation to something more. She searched his face looking for something, anything, that might give her clarity. But there was only a gentle smile, the kind that made her breath catch. "I've missed it too," she said, her voice a little shaky, betraying the emotions she hadn't known she had buried so deeply. She hadn't realized how much her life had lacked genuine connection until Ryan's presence filled the spaces she had once thought too empty to hold anything meaningful. As they sat together, the air between them charged with the quiet tension of unspoken things, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if this moment was the beginning of something entirely new for her. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for but couldn't deny. In that moment, she realized that she had taken a risk, a small one, a quiet one, but a risk nonetheless. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was one worth taking. ChatGPT can. As the evening wore on and Ryan left, Eleanor stood by the window, watching him disappear down the path. The warmth of his presence lingered in the room, wrapping itself around her like a soft, comforting blanket. Yet, as the door clicked shut behind him, a coldness crept in. She leaned against the windowsill, her mind racing. She had thought about the possibility of this moment for days, but now that it had come, she wasn't sure what to make of it. She traced the edge of her teacup with her finger, still feeling the phantom warmth of his touch on the porcelain, and a single thought lingered in her mind. Was it foolish to feel this way? Her mind swirled with memories of her life, decades of work, friends, family, but above all, silence. A quiet, steady rhythm that had become too familiar. She had grown used to solitude, to filling her days with routines and obligations. She had never imagined that at 53, she would be questioning what it meant to feel truly alive again, to yearn for someone, especially someone so much younger than she was. But there it was, unmistakable in its presence, her feelings for Ryan. It wasn't just a fleeting crush. She could feel it in the way her heart fluttered when he laughed, in the way her body had yearned for his touch, even though she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge it until now. The thought of him stirred something deep inside her, something she had buried long ago under layers of practicality of reason. Her thoughts turned inward as she sat back down at the table, her gaze drifting over the empty chairs. What would people think if they knew? She had always prided herself on being composed, grounded. She had accepted the fact that love wasn't something that needed to be sought out anymore. There were no more fantasies, no more dreams of the future that had once seemed so possible. Or so she had thought. But then Ryan had entered her life. And now, everything felt unsettled. She had lived through the clichés, the ones that told her she was too old for such things, that love and desire were privileges of the young, or at least of those still under the illusion of timelessness. And yet, as she thought about him, as she remembered his laugh, the spark in his eyes, she couldn't shake the thought that those ideas didn't apply to her anymore. She didn't want to let them. She was aware of the judgments that might come if she were to pursue anything with him. Would people understand? Would they mock her, pity her, or worse, dismiss her? The weight of their expectations pressed down on her, but she couldn't help but question them. Why couldn't she experience love, joy, and intimacy in her 50s? Why should age define what she could or couldn't feel? Eleanor closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The fear was there, yes, the fear of ridicule, the fear of being dismissed as a woman who didn't know her place. But somewhere, just beneath the surface, was a growing sense of freedom. She had spent so many years adhering to societal expectations, trying to be the right kind of woman, the right kind of mother, the right kind of professional. But perhaps there was more to her than any label could define. Perhaps she could embrace this, allow herself to feel something unexpected, even if it defied what the world expected from her. Love wasn't about age, she realized. It was about connection, about shared moments, about the way someone made you feel alive in a way that had nothing to do with the number of years you had lived. Ryan made her feel more than she had in a long time, more than she ever thought she was allowed to feel. With that, Eleanor stood up, a new resolve settling over her. She would not let the doubts rule her. She had spent too much of her life living by others' rules. Now it was time to listen to her own heart, to acknowledge that the love she felt wasn't bound by age or time. It was hers, and it was real. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing her lips where she could still taste the warmth of his smile. No matter what the world thought, she was allowed to feel this. She was allowed to embrace the possibility of love at any stage in her life, without fear or hesitation. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she was truly living. The days that followed were filled with a quiet certainty. Eleanor didn't rush into anything, but the weight that had once hung over her, this unspoken fear that she was too old, too out of place, began to lift. She felt lighter, freer, like a person waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. Every small interaction with Ryan now carried a deeper significance. It was no longer just a pleasant exchange. It was something that reached deeper, something unspoken yet profound. She had learned to savor the simple moments. The way his eyes softened when he spoke to her, the way he always seemed to listen, truly listen. There was a vulnerability in him, too, she had come to realize. It was in the way he would share fragments of his past, his hesitations, the small insecurities that humanized him in ways she hadn't expected. Ryan, for all his youth and energy, was still searching for something just like her. And in that mutual understanding, in the unspoken connection between them, she found solace. He wasn't trying to fix her, nor was she trying to fix him. They simply were, two people finding their way through life in ways that hadn't been planned or expected. Eleanor found herself thinking about love in a new light. It wasn't just about passion or fleeting moments of excitement, though those were undeniably part of it. It was about acceptance, about giving someone the space to be who they were and loving them for all of it, youthful, older, vulnerable, strong. Love was not bound by time, she realized. It didn't have to make sense to anyone else. It only had to make sense to her. When she closed her eyes now, she no longer saw a reflection of herself as she had once believed, aging, fading into the background. Instead, she saw a woman alive with possibility. She was not defined by the years behind her, but by the choices she made, the people she loved, and the moments that filled her heart with joy. Eleanor had once thought that love was a chapter she had closed. But she realized now that love didn't have to be a story with a beginning and end. It could be ongoing, shifting, evolving. It didn't have to be defined by a number on a calendar or the limitations of what others expected. Love could be anything, and it could come at any time. As she sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street, she felt a deep, gentle contentment. Life had surprised her, and for once, she wasn't afraid to let it. She had the rest of her life to write her own story, and she knew she would never again let age or fear dictate how that story unfolded. In love, as in life, there were no rules. Only the heart's quiet, brave decisions to follow its path, wherever it may lead. And so Eleanor's story continued.